Okay, welcome everybody to our morning session on extended knowledge in education. And our first speaker is Mark Alfano. He's talking about factitious intellectual virtues.
Great, thanks. So the stuff I want to talk about today is in part based on the second half of my first book here. And I was grateful for the chance to think about it again, in part because no one who's engaged with the book has actually engaged with this part of it. All of the reviews have basically focused on the first 2 chapters, or maybe the first 3 or 4 chapters. And the chapters 5, 6, 7 are all about the intellectual virtues, which in a way I'm more interested in than the moral cases, because I'm not a particularly moral person. So the thing that is sort of motivating this inquiry is the worry that traditional virtues, including both reliabilist and responsibilist virtues, might not be empirically adequate. And you might think, well, you know, people are terrible, so why would it be such a big problem if it turned out that they didn't have virtues? But if you're coming at it from a philosophy of education perspective, that I think is not even on the table, because you have to worry about what traits you're instilling in people, or what traits you're trying at least to instill in people. So even if you think that you might not get all the way, at the very least you don't want to instill intellectual vices in your pupils. And it would be nice if you actually managed to instill some intellectual virtues or proto-intellectual virtues, or at least set people on the right path towards developing them. And I worry that a lot of the educational system, at least in the US and probably also in a lot of other places, in fact instills a great many intellectual vices as opposed to intellectual virtues. In particular, we seem to beat the curiosity out of kids at a very young age, and sort of put them on the path to thinking about education as an epistemically sort of extrinsic rather than intrinsic good, which once you do that, I mean, the game is over. So the thing I want to talk about today is the idea that, at least in some cases, there's a tendency for trait attributions to function as self-fulfilling prophecies. And this sort of mimics, to some extent, the moral case. There's a great deal of evidence that, for instance, telling someone that you trust them or you find them trustworthy actually makes them more trustworthy, and is more effective than just praising them and saying you're a good person. More effective than telling them that they performed in a trustworthy way in some particular case, and much more effective than exhortation, telling them that they ought to be trustworthy or they should be trustworthy. In the intellectual case, it's complicated. So when there's a lot of evidence that telling kids that they're intelligent can actually backfire, and this is quite worrisome. In particular, what seems to happen is that there's a sort of split mindset about intelligence, where some people think of it in a kind of incremental way, where intelligence is a thing that you slowly earn more of. And some people think of it, this is Carol Dweck's terminology, in an entity way. And if you have an entity theory of intelligence, you think it's sort of like branded into your brain at birth, and it's fixed. And people who have an entity theory of intelligence actually tend to do a little bit better in sort of low and medium stress intellectual endeavors. And when they run across something that they can't handle, they sort of give up. So they think, you know, I'm pretty good, I'm good. And then when they run into something they can't handle, they think, well, I'm good and I can't do it right away, so it must be impossible, or it must be too hard, or it's, I'm just not good enough for this, and they give up. So there's a huge amount of literature from 50, 60 years now on the Pygmalion effect and the ways in which that can go wrong. The Pygmalion effect was sort of dubbed back in I think the 50s or the early 60s, and the idea was you make someone into what you think that they already are, right? So it's the self-fulfilling prophecy idea. But the empirical work on it was really bad, just shockingly bad. And it turns out that when you tell children that they're intelligent, you do get a slight boost out of it in the very first instance, but then as soon as they run up against a wall, they give up. So I'm quite wary of the drawbacks of this strategy, of the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy strategy. But with other intellectual virtues, it's not at all clear that you get this backfiring effect. And I think the right distinction to draw is between virtues that are either are or are conceived of as purely cognitive on the one hand, where you get a backfiring, because people tend to think of them as in an entity rather than an incremental way, and intellectual virtues that have some kind of motivational component, or at least are conceived of as having some motivational component, because it's more or less impossible to think of them in an entity way. You have to think of them in an incremental way where the more you try, the more you have it, because they have this motivational thing built into them. And there's a fair bit of literature suggesting that, or at least that is consistent with that interpretation. So telling people that they are curious, that they are open-minded, that they are intellectually courageous and so on, does seem to function as a self-fulfilling prophecy and does seem not to backfire in this entity way. And if that's right, it raises a number of interesting questions from the point of view of education, because we engage in a lot of assessment in education, and can't help but think of our pupils not only as people who have performed more or less well on various assessments of their knowledge, but also as intellectual agents. You think of a letter of recommendation. When you write a letter of recommendation, you're more or less listing off someone's intellectual virtues. And if all you manage to say in a letter of recommendation is like, this person did well on this task, it's shockingly bad, right? It's like the Gricean letter, right? Like, it's good handwriting, I don't know. So we do this anyway, and I think that we need to do it more mindfully. So the thing that I'm interested in here is both the extent to which expectations are self-fulfilling and the reasons they might be if they are. I think I was a bit overconfident in the book in how much of an effect there is. I think it's much easier to instill or introduce intellectual vices through self-fulfilling prophecies than it is to instill intellectual virtues, which is unfortunate. But at the very least, we don't want to do that. So telling people that they're stupid, telling people that they're lazy, it's like one of the worst things you can possibly do as a teacher. But there does seem to be some reason to think that the virtue attributions do function in some cases with some people in the right contexts as self-fulfilling prophecies, and I'm interested in why that might be. the best explanation that I've been able to sort of formulate so far is this idea that, well, there's probably multiple mechanisms. So one of the mechanisms is just sort of a crass kind of Hobbesian thing where people are intrinsically esteem-seeking. This is just the kind of animals that we are. We really care about the esteem of our conspecifics. And one kind of esteem is intellectual esteem. So if you show somebody that you think that they're intelligent, or you show somebody that you think that they're intellectually motivated in the right way, that's a manifestation of esteem, and people don't want to lose that. They want to hold on to that. And one way to hold on to that is to keep performing in the way that gets them that esteem. As I say, it's a bit sort of Hobbesian and crass. And it also worryingly, for reasons that Tori McGeer has pointed out, is the sort of mechanism that doesn't survive its own elevation to mutual knowledge. So if I know that the only reason you're telling me that I'm good at something, or that I'm well motivated with regard to some intellectual domain, is so that I will think that you think highly of me, so that I will keep doing something, then I'm going to be kind of annoyed, as opposed to feeling that I've got your esteem. So it's sort of a Euthyphro kind of thing. Like, do you think well of me because I'm good, or am I good because you think well of me? So that kind of thing, while it has its place, I think is not going to be a particularly robust mechanism. A second kind of mechanism that I've been interested in, and which I think is actually, the more I think about it, the more I think there's something to it, is actually a kind of Anscomian kind of idea, which is connected with her claim that you can't intend to do something that you take to be impossible. So I can't intend to swim to Australia. I can intend to try to swim to Australia. I can form the intention to show as if, or make as if I intend. I can jump in the ocean and start going a little bit of the way, but in any of those cases, I don't actually intend to swim to Australia. And one of the things that attributions of traits or other kinds of signaling that you think someone's got a trait, or maybe just maybe has a trait, can do is to show someone that something is possible for them. And I actually think a lot of education involves the opening up of possibilities for pupils in their own minds. People come in either having not even considered it as a possibility that they can do things, or having concluded that they can't do certain things. And a lot of what we do as educators is to make it seem to people that, well, maybe I can actually do this thing. And then they can try. You can't actually intend to do it if you think that you can't do it, and you can't intend to do it if it hasn't even occurred to you as a possibility. So I think that one thing that trait attributions can help to accomplish is to open up worlds of possibility to students. That might sound kind of highfalutin, but I think there's something to that. A third way in which this might work has to do neither with sort of crass esteem-seeking, nor with opening up possibilities, but instead with some kind of integrity. It turns out that people are really keen both to live up to or down to whatever expectations are signaled to them socially, but humans also find it really hard to act in ways that are out of step with their own self-concept. So maybe there are people like Frankfurt-style wantons who don't have any higher order desires, don't have any second order beliefs even. But the vast majority of people do think of themselves in certain ways. And it's intrinsically rewarding to act in accordance with your own self-concept, and intrinsically punishing to act sufficiently out of step with your own self-concept such that you recognize it and feel that you either have to revise your self-concept or that you have to change your behavior. People don't like to do that. And I don't think that that reflects poorly on people. I think that's just part of what it means to be a human. So to the extent that when we tell people that they've got a trait that makes them revise their self-concept or bolster it or makes more salient a part of it that was already there, and in fact that seems to be when it works best, right? Just introducing it out of nowhere to someone doesn't work nearly as well as telling someone who's sort of halfway there in the first place that they've got this trait. To the extent that in some way influences self-concept, it's going to set up this kind of self-expectation mechanism where people monitor themselves to make sure that they're behaving in a way that's consistent with what they think of themselves. And when that's the case, you tell someone that they're open-minded, they say, yeah, I guess I am kind of open-minded, and then they keep track of that and force themselves to act that way. It can seem sort of manipulative, which is a worry, but I think actually that the manipulation interpretation is not the right way to think of it, and this is why I'm talking about this stuff at the extended knowledge conference. So one way to understand all of this stuff is that, Duncan tells me like, well, you're a very good writer, and I think like, oh shit, now I need to write well. And that's one way to understand what happens, and I'm sure that happens sometimes. Another way to think of it, which is what I mostly argued for in the book, is that knowing whether an object has a disposition is just a really hard thing to do. And you are always thresholding and fine-tuning in some way. And so you might think that there could be a kind of pragmatic intrusion on that thresholding where you accept a little bit less evidence as sufficient for attributing a virtue than you do for attributing a vice. It's hard enough to know anyway, and you think, well, what are the payoffs and what are the costs associated with getting this right and wrong? In the case of attributing a virtue, if you're right, good for you. If you're wrong, maybe you make someone more virtuous anyway. That both of those seem pretty good. In the case of attributing a vice, if you're right, well, I guess bully for you. But if you're wrong, you could actually make someone worse, which is hopefully the sort of thing you don't want to do. So you might have just sort of asymmetric standards of evidence for attributing virtues and vices, both in the moral and in the intellectual domain, except for intelligence and other purely cognitive virtues because of this weird backfiring effect. But the thing that I've been thinking more recently is actually that part of what it is to have an intellectual virtue is to be placed in a social setting where people have and express or signal their expectations about your intellectual motivation and behavior to you. So the actual constitution of an intellectual virtue involves the other, involves other people. I suppose it's possible to think of like a curious Robin Crusoe, but I find that really hard to imagine myself. And even if it's possible, in the vast majority of cases, I think that the right way to understand both moral and intellectual virtues is that they are partially socially constituted in this way. That what it means for you to be trustworthy is that I'm trusting. And what it means for me to be open-minded is that you think of me as open-minded, at least partially, right? So that's not the whole story. There has to be something in the agent as well, and we have to be receptive to that kind of signal. But if that's on the right track, then we are, as I tried to say during the Q&A for Heather's talk yesterday, we are, in a very literal sense, our brothers and our sisters' keepers. We're actually partially constitutive of the virtues and vices of those around us, which is a huge responsibility to take on the one hand, but also sort of interesting and empowering and exciting on the other. And this sort of picture of the human agent as a kind of monadic thing that just goes around and expresses its dispositions, and it might be in eliciting conditions or not, I think is just not an adequate way to conceive of hypersocial animals like us. So if that's on the right track, we are all partial constituents of our own students' intellectual virtues and vices. Which you might be reluctant to take on as a responsibility, but I think is actually the right way to think of things. And if you do think of it that way, it's actually, education turns out to be much more exciting. It turns out to be the sort of thing where you have a much bigger effect than just being a conduit of information. We talked a lot yesterday about information, and I think information transfer is clearly a big part of education, but if that's all it is, or if that's all that we conceive it to be, we're missing a lot. We're missing, in particular, the way in which we constitute the virtues and vices of our pupils, and thereby also, to some extent, ourselves. So I guess I'll end with one sort of, I have to mention Nietzsche. Interesting line from Nietzsche. So in his very early essay, Schopenhauer's Educator, he makes this claim, which he never actually abandoned, that the real self does not lie deep within you, but as he puts it, immeasurably high above you. Your self is what you aspire to, or what inspires you. And when we give our students aspirations, or when we inspire them, I think that we're actually changing their real selves or their true selves. We're influencing who they are. And as I say, that's a huge responsibility, but it's also an incredibly exciting one. I'll stop there.